The scream that shattered the silence at 3:17 a.m. would haunt Marcus Chen for the rest of his life. But what terrified him more than the sound itself was the realization that it had come from the throat of a girl who hadn't spoken a single word in 7 years, standing in the marble hallway of the Whitmore estate, mop bucket forgotten at his feet. Marcus stared at the security monitor displaying the empty corridor outside Sophia Whitmore's bedroom, empty, yet he had just heard her scream, with a clarity that made his blood freeze. The timestamp on the monitor read 3:17 a.m., the exact moment he'd heard the sound, but according to the camera, nothing had happened. This was Marcus's first week as a night janitor at the Whitmore mansion, and already he was questioning his sanity. The Joe paid 3 times what he'd made at his previous position, enough to cover his daughter's medical bills and maybe, just maybe, give her the surgery she desperately needed. But as he stood in that opulent hallway, surrounded by priceless art and suffocating silence, Marcus wondered if some jobs came with a price too high to pay. The Whitmore family was Philadelphia's most mysterious dynasty. Richard Whitmore had built his empire from nothing, transforming a small construction company into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that touched everything from real estate to biotechnology. But it was his daughter Sophia who captured the public's fascination and their fear. 7 years ago, when Sophia was only 8 years old, she had witnessed something that stole her voice forever. The official story was a car accident that claimed her mother's life, but the servants whispered of something far more sinister. They spoke in hushed tones about the night Alina Whitmore died, about the things Sophia might have seen, and about why a little girl would choose silence over speech for 7 long years. Marcus had dismissed these rumors as typical household gossip, but standing in that hallway, listening to the echo of a scream that shouldn't have existed, he began to wonder if the servants knew something the rest of the world didn't. The security system at the Whitmore estate was state-of-the-art. Every hallway, every room, every corner was monitored 24/7. The cameras never lied, never missed anything. Yet tonight, they had missed Sophia's scream, or someone wanted them to. Marcus checked his watch. 3:23 a.m. His shift wouldn't end for another 4 hours, but already his hands were shaking. He had taken this job out of desperation, not choice. His 8-year-old daughter Emma had been diagnosed with a rare heart condition that required experimental surgery. The treatment wasn't covered by insurance, and the cost $200,000 might as well have been $200 million for a single father working as a janitor. When the position at the Whitmore estate opened up, Marcus had applied immediately. The salary was generous, almost suspiciously so, but he hadn't asked questions. Desperate people rarely do. Now, as he resumed his cleaning duties, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he'd bargained for. The mansion felt alive around him, its shadows shifting and breathing with secrets that had been buried for 7 years. And at the center of it all was Sophia Whitmore, a 15-year-old girl whose silence might be the only thing keeping her alive. The second scream came at 4:45 a.m. This time Marcus was in the library, dusting the endless rows of leather-bound volumes that no one had touched in years. The sound cut through the air like a blade, more agonized than the first, carrying with it a desperation that made Marcus's chest tighten with panic. He dropped his cleaning cloth and ran toward the source of the sound, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. But when he reached Sophia's corridor, he found the same thing he'd found before. Nothing. The hallway was empty, the security cameras showing no activity, no evidence that anything had disturbed the perfect stillness of the Whitmore mansion. Yet Marcus knew what he'd heard. The scream had been real, raw, filled with a kind of terror that no acting could replicate, and it had definitely come from Sophia's room. Standing outside her door, Marcus pressed his ear against the polished wood. Silence, not even the sound of breathing. It was as if the room beyond held nothing but empty air. But Marcus could feel something else, a presence, watching, waiting. His hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. He knew he shouldn't enter. His employment contract had been very specific about boundaries, about areas of the house that were off limits to staff. Sophia's room was at the top of that list, but the screams. God, the screams sounded like someone was being murdered. The door handle turned easily under his grip, too easily, as if someone had left it unlocked on purpose. The room beyond was a shrine to interrupted childhood. Expensive toys sat untouched on pristine shelves. A canopy bed dominated one wall, its white curtains drawn closed. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, casting everything in silver and shadow. And there, in the corner near the window, sat Sophia Whitmore. Marcus had seen photographs of her, of course. The media had been obsessed with the silent heiress for years, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of her presence. She was small for 15, with dark hair that fell in waves around her shoulders and pale skin that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Her eyes were the most striking feature, large, dark, and filled with an intelligence that seemed far too old for her face. She was awake, sitting in a chair by the window, and she was staring directly at him. Marcus froze in the doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sophia's gaze was steady, unblinking, as if she had been expecting him. There was no surprise in her expression, no fear at finding a stranger in her room, just a calm acceptance that was somehow more terrifying than any scream. I heard ... double quotes. Marcus started, then stopped. What was he supposed to say? That he'd heard her screaming when she hadn't made a sound, that the security cameras had somehow missed her cries for help. Sophia tilted her head slightly, a gesture that reminded Marcus painfully of his own daughter. For a moment, her facade cracked, and he saw something vulnerable underneath a frightened girl who had been carrying an unbearable secret for 7 years. Then she raised one finger to her lips in the universal gesture for silence, and Marcus understood. Not just that she wanted him to be quiet, but that silence itself was her shield, her weapon, her only protection against something too terrible to speak aloud. She stood then, moving with the fluid grace of someone much older, and walked to her desk. Marcus watched, transfixed, as she pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. Her movements were quick, practiced, as if she had done this many times before. When she finished, she walked over to Marcus and handed him the note. Her fingers brushed against his as she passed the paper, and her skin was ice cold. The note contained only 4 words, written in elegant cursive. "He's watching us now." Marcus looked up from the paper to find Sophia back at the window, but now she was pointing at something outside. He followed her gaze and saw a figure standing in the garden below, barely visible in the shadows of an ancient oak tree. The figure was too distant to make out clearly, but Marcus could see that whoever it was had been watching Sophia's window, watching them. As soon as Marcus spotted the figure, it melted back into the darkness, disappearing as silently as smoke. But not before Marcus caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. The figure had been wearing the same dark uniform that he wore. Someone else was in the house, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Sophia turned back to him and mouthed a single word: "Run." Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He backed out of the room, closing the door as quietly as possible, his mind racing. Who had been watching them? Why had Sophia warned him? And most importantly, what had she been screaming about if the cameras couldn't pick up the sound? The rest of his shift passed in a blur of paranoia and fear. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every creak of the old mansion's settling bones sounded like approaching footsteps. Marcus found himself checking over his shoulder constantly, waiting for someone to emerge from the darkness and demand to know what he'd been doing in Sophia's room. But no one came. The mansion remained as silent as a tomb until the sun began to rise, painting the eastern windows gold. Marcus's replacement, an elderly man named Frank who had worked at the estate for over a decade, arrived at 7 a.m. sharp. "Quiet night?" Frank asked, settling into the security booth with practiced ease. Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. "Word of advice, Instead, he simply nodded and gathered his things, not looking up from his newspaper. As he prepared to leave, some things in this house are better left alone. The girl especially. The family's been through enough tragedy without staff poking around where they don't belong." There was a warning in Frank's voice, clear as a bell, but also something else: fear. This man who had worked at the estate for 10 years was afraid of something, and Marcus had the sinking feeling he was about to find out what. The drive home took Marcus through the affluent suburbs of Philadelphia, past manicured lawns and houses that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. But his mind wasn't on the scenery. It was on Sophia Whitmore and her impossible screams, on the figure in the garden, on the note that was now burning a hole in his pocket. "He's watching us now." Who was watching? Richard Whitmore? Some unknown threat? Or was Sophia's 7 years of silence finally catching up with her in the form of psychological breakdown? Marcus's apartment was a stark contrast to the Whitmore mansion, small, cramped, furnished with second-hand pieces and held together by necessity rather than choice. But it was home, and most importantly, it was where Emma was waiting for him. His daughter was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread out before her. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with the kind of pure joy that only children can manage. "Daddy, how was work?" Marcus forced a smile, pushing thoughts of screaming girls and mysterious figures to the back of his mind. "It was fine, sweetheart. How are you feeling today?" Emma's smile faltered slightly. She was only 8, but she was smart enough to know that her daddy's new job was about more than just paying bills. It was about keeping her alive. "Good," she said, but Marcus could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The medication made her tired, and the frequent doctor visits were taking their toll. "Dr. Peterson wants to see me again next week." Marcus nodded, his jaw clenching. Dr. Peterson was the specialist who would perform Emma's surgery if Marcus could come up with the money. The Whitmore job paid well, but even with the generous salary, it would take months to save enough for the procedure. Months that Emma might not have. As if reading his thoughts, Emma reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were small and fragile, but her grip was firm. "It's going to be okay, Daddy, I know it is." The faith in her voice nearly broke Marcus's heart. 8 years old, facing a life-threatening condition, and she was comforting him. He squeezed her hand gently, making a silent promise that whatever was happening at the Whitmore estate, whatever danger he might be walking into, he would see it through. For her, after Emma left for school, Marcus tried to sleep, but his mind wasn't quiet. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sophia's pale face, heard the echo of screams that didn't exist, felt the cold touch of her fingers as she handed him that cryptic note. By afternoon, he had given up on rest entirely. Instead, he found himself at the public library, using one of their computers to research the Whitmore family. What he found made his blood run cold. The official story of Elena Whitmore's death was straightforward enough. Car accident on a rainy night 7 years ago. She had been driving alone when her car skidded off a mountain road and crashed into a ravine. Her body had been recovered 3 days later. Sophia, who had been in the car, had survived with minor physical injuries but had never spoken about what happened. In fact, she had never spoken at all since that night. But as Marcus dug deeper, he found inconsistencies, witness reports that didn't match the official timeline, questions about why Elena had been driving alone on that particular road at that time of night, and most disturbing of all, a sealed police report that had been buried under layers of legal red tape. The deeper Marcus looked, the more convinced he became that Elena Whitmore's death had been no accident. But if it wasn't an accident, then what had really happened that night? And what had Sophia seen that was so terrible it had stolen her voice? As the day wore on, Marcus found himself obsessing over every detail he could uncover. He read old newspaper articles, searched through public records, even found archived footage of the Whitmore family from before Elena's death. In every photo, every video, Sophia had been a bright, talkative child. The contrast with the silent girl he'd met the night before was stark and heartbreaking, but it was in one particular video, taken at a charity gala just weeks before Elena's death, that Marcus noticed something that made his hands tremble. In the background, barely visible among the crowd of elegantly dressed guests, was a man in a server's uniform, a man who looked exactly like the figure Marcus had seen in the garden, the same face, the same build, even the same way of standing, as if ready to disappear into the shadows at a moment's notice. But that was impossible. The video was 7 years old. If the man had been working at the gala then, he would be... Marcus did the math, his heart sinking. The man would be old enough to have been watching the Whitmore family for years, long enough to know all their secrets, long enough to be the reason Elena Whitmore was dead, and now he was back. Marcus closed the laptop with shaking hands, his mind reeling. He had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about a traumatized girl and her mysterious silence. This was about murder, cover-ups, and secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect. But as he sat in the library, surrounded by the quiet murmur of other patrons going about their normal lives, Marcus realized something else. He was probably the only person who knew the truth, the only person who had seen the figure in the garden, who had received Sophia's warning, which meant he was the only person who could help her. The decision crystallized in his mind with startling clarity. He would go back to the Whitmore estate that night, but this time he would be prepared. He would find out what was really happening in that mansion, what had really happened to Elena Whitmore 7 years ago, and if necessary, he would risk everything to keep Sophia safe. Because sometimes, Marcus thought as he gathered his things and headed home, the right thing to do is also the most dangerous. And sometimes, a desperate father trying to save his own child finds himself in a position to save someone else's as well. The sun was setting as Marcus prepared for his second night at the Whitmore estate. He packed differently this time, a small flashlight, his cell phone with the camera ready, and a digital recorder he'd borrowed from Emma's school project supplies. If something happened tonight, he wanted evidence, but more than that, he wanted answers. The mansion looked different in the evening light, more ominous somehow. The Gothic architecture that had seemed merely impressive during his first visit now appeared almost malevolent, as if the building itself was complicit in whatever dark secrets it housed. Frank was waiting for him in the security booth, but tonight the old man seemed agitated, nervous in a way that immediately put Marcus on edge. "Listen, son," Frank said before Marcus could even set down his supplies. "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I need to tell you something about the girl." Marcus waited, sensing that whatever Frank was about to say would be important. "She wasn't always silent," Frank continued, lowering his voice even though they were alone. "Before the accident, Sophia was one of the most talkative kids you'd ever meet, always asking questions, always curious about everything. But after that night, it wasn't just that she stopped talking. It was like she stopped being a kid altogether." "What do you think happened?" Marcus asked. Frank glanced around nervously, as if worried they might be overheard. "I think she saw something that night. Something that scared her so badly she decided silence was safer than the truth." "And you think whatever she saw is still a threat?" "I think," Frank said slowly, "that some secrets are worth killing for. And I think whoever killed Elena Whitmore isn't done yet." The old man's words hung in the air like a curse. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, but also a strange sense of validation. Frank's suspicions confirmed his own growing certainty that the Whitmores were living under a shadow of danger that went far beyond grief and trauma. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. Frank met his eyes directly for the first time. Because I'm retiring next week, 65 years old, and I've never been so scared in my life. But if you've got a daughter, don't you? Someone you'd do anything to protect. Marcus nodded. Then maybe you'll understand why I can't keep quiet anymore. That girl needs help, and I'm too old and too scared to give it to her. But you might be young enough and brave enough to make a difference. With that cryptic statement, Frank gathered his things and left, leaving Marcus alone with the security monitors and a growing sense of dread. As the night deepened around the mansion, Marcus found himself watching the screens more intently than ever, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of the mysterious figure he'd seen in the garden. At 2:30 a.m., he found it. The figure appeared first on the camera covering the east garden, moving with the same silent grace Marcus had witnessed the night before. This time, however, Marcus was ready. He adjusted the camera angle, zoomed in, and managed to capture a clear image of the intruder's face. What he saw made his blood freeze. The man was older than he'd appeared from a distance, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it wasn't his age that shocked Marcus. It was the fact that he recognized the face from the archived footage he'd found earlier. This was definitely the same man who had been at the charity gala 7 years ago, which meant he had been watching the Whitmore family since before Elena's death, and now he was back lurking in the shadows waiting for something. Marcus reached for his phone, intending to call the police, when something on another monitor caught his attention. Sophia's bedroom door was opening. The girl emerged into the hallway, moving with the same ethereal grace she'd displayed the night before. She was wearing a white nightgown that made her look like a ghost drifting through the mansion's corridors. But there was nothing ghostly about her purpose. She was heading directly toward the main staircase, and from there, the garden where the intruder was waiting. Marcus abandoned the security booth and ran through the mansion's hallways, his heart pounding with panic. Whatever was about to happen, he couldn't let Sophia face it alone. The girl might be silent, but she was still just a child, and children shouldn't have to confront the monsters that haunted their nightmares. He reached the garden just as Sophia stepped through the French doors that led from the mansion's main floor. The intruder was waiting for her beneath the ancient oak tree, and in the moonlight, Marcus could see that he was holding something in his hand, something that glinted silver in the pale light. A knife. Sophia knew, Marcus shouted, breaking cover as he rushed toward them. Both figures turned at the sound of his voice, but their reactions couldn't have been more different. The intruder's face twisted with rage and something that looked like panic. Sophia, on the other hand, seemed almost relieved, as if intervention had been exactly what she'd been hoping for. "You're not supposed to be here," the intruder snarled, raising the knife threateningly. "This doesn't concern you." "Like hell it doesn't," Marcus replied, positioning himself between Sophia and the armed man. "What do you want with her?" The intruder laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Want with her? She's the one who's been calling me here night after night, screaming for me to come back and finish what I started." Marcus glanced back at Sophia, confusion mixing with his fear. What is he talking about? But Sophia just shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. And for the first time since Marcus had met her, she opened her mouth as if to speak. No sound emerged, but her lips clearly formed a single word: liar. 7 years, the intruder continued, his voice growing more agitated. 7 years I've been waiting for her to remember what really happened that night, what she saw, what she knows. "What did she see?" Marcus demanded, though part of him was afraid to hear the answer. "She saw me kill her mother," the man said, simply, "and she's been carrying that secret ever since." The confession hung in the air like poison. Marcus felt his knees weaken, not just from the horror of the revelation, but from the implications. If this man had killed Elena Whitmore 7 years ago, why was he back now? What had changed? As if reading his thoughts, the intruder smiled coldly. "Richard Whitmore is dying. Cancer, he's got maybe 6 months left. And when he dies, little Sophia here inherits everything. Billions of dollars that should have been mine, yours." Marcus couldn't keep the confusion out of his voice. "Elena was going to leave Richard for me. We had it all planned. She was going to take Sophia and half the family fortune, and we were going to start a new life together. But then she got cold feet. Started talking about working things out with her husband, about staying for Sophia's sake. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture so ugly that Marcus wanted to look away. "So, you killed her." "I made it look like an accident. Would have been perfect too, except for the kid. She saw everything, but instead of speaking up, she went silent." Smart girl. Knew that staying quiet was the only way to stay alive. Marcus's mind was racing, trying to process everything he'd learned. But why now? Why come back after all this time? Because Richard's will leaves everything to Sophia, with a trust that becomes hers when she turns 18. That's only 3 years away, too close for comfort. The intruder's grip tightened on the knife. But if something were to happen to her now, while she's still a minor, the inheritance would go to Richard's brother, a man who owes me some very large gambling debts. The coldness of the plan was breathtaking. This man had already murdered one person to get his hands on the Whitmore fortune. and now he was prepared to kill a child to claim what he believed was rightfully his. "You're insane," Marcus said, taking a step closer to Sophia. "You'll never get away with this." "I got away with it before," the intruder replied, "and this time will be even easier." A troubled girl, traumatized by her mother's death, finally succumbs to her grief, so tragic, so believable. Marcus realized with growing horror that the man had probably been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. The screams Sophia had been producing, the ones only Marcus could hear, weren't random. They were a cry for help, a desperate attempt to communicate with someone, anyone, who might be able to save her. But how had she known Marcus would be able to hear them when the security cameras couldn't pick up the sound? The answer came to him in a flash of intuition that was almost supernatural in its clarity. Sophia hadn't been screaming out loud at all. She had been screaming in her mind, projecting her terror and desperation with the same psychic intensity that had kept her silent for 7 years. And somehow, Marcus's own desperate need to protect his daughter had made him sensitive to her mental cries for help. It sounded impossible, but then again, everything about this situation was impossible. "She's been calling to me," Marcus said suddenly, the realization giving him strength. "She knew you were coming back, and she's been trying to find someone who could help her." The intruder's expression darkened. More reason to finish this quickly. He lunged forward with the knife, but Marcus was ready. Years of working construction had given him quick reflexes and strong arms. He caught the intruder's wrist, deflecting the blade away from Sophia, and the two men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The fight was brutal but brief. The intruder was older and out of shape, while Marcus was driven by the fury of a parent protecting a child. Within moments, Marcus had the upper hand, pinning the intruder to the ground and wresting the knife away from him. "Sophia, run," he shouted. "Get to the house and call the police." But when he looked up, Sophia hadn't moved. She was standing, exactly where she had been, staring down at her mother's killer with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. There was fear there, yes, but also something else. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. Then, for the first time in 7 years, Sophia Whitmore spoke. "No," she said, her voice quiet but clear as crystal. "He needs to hear what I have to say first." The intruder stopped, struggling, his eyes widening in shock. Marcus loosened his grip slightly, equally stunned by the sound of Sophia's voice. "You want to know what I saw that night?" Sophia continued, her words growing stronger with each sentence. "You want to know what I've been carrying for 7 years?" The intruder nodded mutely, fear replacing the confidence that had driven him moments before. "I saw you arguing with my mother by the car. I saw you grab the steering wheel while she was driving. I saw the look on your face when we went over the edge, not panic, but satisfaction. And I saw you climb out of the car and walk away while my mother was dying." Sophia's voice was steady now, each word delivered with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what I don't know what you're talking about," the intruder stammered. "You came back," Sophia said simply. "While I was trapped in the car, crying for help, you came back to make sure my mother was dead. And when you saw that I was still alive, do you know what you did?" Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what Sophia was about to reveal. "You leaned down to my window and you whispered, 'If you ever tell anyone what really happened, I'll come back for you. I'll come back for your father. I'll kill everyone you love until you're all alone in the world.' And then you left me there to die with my mother." The confession was devastating in its simplicity. This man hadn't just murdered Alina Whitmore. He had terrorized her 8-year-old daughter into 7 years of silence. And now, just as he had promised, he had come back to finish the job. "But here's what you didn't count on," Sophia continued, and now there was steel in her voice. "You didn't count on me finding someone else to protect. Someone who would care enough to listen to my screams and brave enough to help me face you." She looked at Marcus with gratitude that made his heart ache. "And you didn't count on the fact that after 7 years of silence, I would have a lot to say." The intruder tried to struggle again, but Marcus's grip held firm. In the distance, they could hear sirens approaching. Someone, probably Frank, must have called the police when the security system detected the disturbance in the garden. As the police cars pulled up the mansion's long driveway, their red and blue lights painting the garden in alternating colors of emergency and resolution, Marcus helped Sophia to her feet. She was shaking now, the adrenaline and emotion of finally speaking catching up with her. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked gently. Sophia nodded, then surprised him by reaching out and taking his hand. Her fingers were still cold, but they were stronger than they had been the night before. "Thank you," she whispered. "For the first time in 7 years, I'm not afraid anymore." The police took the intruder away in handcuffs, but not before he confessed to everything: Elena's murder, the years of stalking and threatening Sophia, his plan to kill her for the inheritance money. The evidence Marcus had gathered, combined with Sophia's testimony and the intruder's own admissions, would be more than enough to ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. As dawn broke over the Whitmore estate, Marcus found himself sitting in the garden with Sophia, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. The nightmare was over. but both of them were still processing what had happened. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said eventually. Sophia nodded. "How did you know I would be able to hear your screams when the cameras couldn't pick them up?" Sophia considered the question for a long moment. "I didn't know, not at first. But when you showed up that first night, I could feel something different about you. You were carrying pain, just like I was. And sometimes, people who understand pain can hear things that others can't." It wasn't a scientific explanation, but Marcus found that it made perfect sense. Desperation had a frequency all its own, and people who lived with it learned to recognize it in others. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Live," Sophia said simply. "To talk. Make up for 7 years of silence." She paused, then looked at him with the same gratitude he'd seen earlier. "What about you? Will you keep working here?" Marcus considered the question. The job at the Whitmore estate had been a means to an end, a way to pay for Emma's surgery. But now, after everything that had happened, it felt like something more. "I think so," he said, "at least until I figure out what comes next." Sophia smiled, and Marcus was struck by how different she looked when she wasn't carrying the weight of 7 years' worth of secrets. She looked, for the first time since he'd met her, like a normal 15-year-old girl. "Good," she said. "I think I'm going to need a friend." 3 months later, Marcus stood in the hospital waiting room, pacing nervously as Emma underwent her surgery. The procedure was being performed by the best cardiac surgeon on the East Coast, and it was being paid for by a very generous donation from the Whitmore Foundation, a gift that Richard Whitmore had insisted on making after learning about Marcus's role in saving his daughter's life. Richard had turned out to be very different from what Marcus had expected. The billionaire was indeed dying of cancer, but facing his mortality had given him a clarity about what really mattered. He had been racked with guilt for years, believing that his neglect of Alina had somehow contributed to her death. Learning the truth about what had really happened that night had lifted a weight from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. More importantly, having his daughter's voice back had given Richard something he thought he'd lost forever: hope for the future. "Mr. Chen." Marcus looked up to see the surgeon emerging from the operating room, still in his scrubs but with the smile on his face that told Marcus everything he needed to know. The surgery was a complete success, the doctor said. "Emma's heart is going to be just fine." The relief was so overwhelming that Marcus had to sit down. 7 months ago, he had been a desperate father facing an impossible situation. Now, through a series of events that still seemed surreal, both his daughter and Sophia Whitmore were safe, healthy, and looking toward bright futures. As he waited for Emma to wake up from the anesthesia, Marcus reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had gone to the Whitmore estate looking for money and had found something far more valuable: the knowledge that sometimes, when everything seems lost, help can come from the most unexpected places. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia. "How did the surgery go? Sending love to both of you." Marcus smiled as he typed back, "Perfect. She's going to be fine. Thank you for everything." The response came quickly. "Thank you for listening when no one else could hear me, for being brave when I couldn't be, for showing me that silence isn't always safety, sometimes it's just another kind of prison." Marcus put his phone away and settled in to wait for Emma to wake up. Outside the hospital windows, Philadelphia stretched out under a clear blue sky, full of possibilities that neither he nor Sophia could have imagined just a few months before. Sometimes, Marcus thought, the most dangerous jobs turn out to be the most rewarding ones. And sometimes, trying to save your own child puts you in a position to save someone else's as well. In the end, that's what heroism really is: not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it, to listen when others can't hear, to speak when others remain silent, to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that willingness to act creates ripples that spread far beyond anything you could have imagined, touching lives and changing futures in ways that prove that even in the darkest moments, hope is never really lost. It's just waiting for someone brave enough to find it. The story could have ended there, with Emma's successful surgery and Sophia's liberation from 7 years of terrorized silence. But life, as Marcus was learning, rarely wrapped itself up as neatly as stories do. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Marcus received a call that would drag him back into the shadows of the Whitmore family's past. It was Richard Whitmore himself on the phone, and his voice carried an urgency that immediately put Marcus on alert. "Marcus, I need you to come to the house immediately. There's